silent reflection. Mrs. Galante, would you call the roll, please?
Mrs. Fee?
Here.
Mr. Droz?
Here.
Mr. Croner?
Here.
Mr. Meyer?
Here.
Mrs. Muehlfeld?
Here.
Mrs. Randall?
Here.
Mrs. Weber?
Here. Is there anyone from the public who would like to comment on non-agenda items? Seeing none, members of the Wauwatosa School Board value the input of students, parents, staff members, and community members. The board's regularly scheduled meetings provide an opportunity for opinions and concerns to be expressed publicly. The board values all comments and will respectfully consider this input in decision-making. The board requests that individuals limit their comment on each item to 3 minutes. Following any comment, an individual board member may respond on the issue raised. However, it is not the intent of the public comment portion of the agenda for the board to enter into a debate with a member of the community. Because non-agenda items are not publicly posted in advance, no action will be taken on public comment regarding non-agenda items this evening. May I have approval of the consent agenda.
Move to approve the consent agenda?
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Yes, Michael?
May we please have separate comment? I'd ask for a comment from Dr. Ertl on whether there's any market factors involved in some of the resignations, so we get some context for the compensation discussions that we're having.
I guess I can speak specifically to 2 of the resignations, and I think both of the decisions, I'm sure in part were, I mean, I guess I can't speak to the decision, but I know the finances of it were in the range of $10,000 more to go to a different district. One was a little bit more than 10,000, and one was a little bit less than 10,000. So it's been a concern of administration. We've discussed it in particular with these 2 people and how we'd be able to keep them here. So it is a concern.
Thank you.
Those teachers, Dr. Erna?
Yes.
Okay.
Are there any items on the consent agenda which board members would like to remove for separate discussion or action? Seeing none, is there any further comment on the consent agenda from the board members? Seeing none, is there anyone from the community who would like to speak on the consent agenda? Seeing none, if we may please move on to recognitions, Mrs. Fee?
I believe we
Oh,
need a
sorry,
vote.
I'm sorry. May we have, all in favor of the consent agenda? No, excuse me, I'm gonna have a roll call. Please, Mrs. Galante.
Mrs. Fee?
Yes.
Mr. Droz?
Yes.
Mr. Croner?
Yes.
Mr. Meyer?
Yes.
Mrs. Muehlfeld?
Yes.
Mrs. Randall?
Yes.
Mrs. Weber?
Yes. Now, recognitions, please, Mrs. Fee.
Thank you. Wauwatosa East High School has been named one of America's best high schools by Newsweek magazine. East High School is one of only 12 schools in Wisconsin among 500 elite schools from across the country, chosen by Newsweek from over 1,100 schools as one of the best high schools in America. Newsweek has been ranking the top public high schools in America for over a decade. The magazine recently revamped its methodology this year in hopes of highlighting solutions. Newsweek enlisted a panel of experts to develop a yardstick that fully reflects the school's success, turning out college-ready and life-ready students. To this end, each school's score is comprised of 6 components. Graduation rate is 25%, college matriculation rate 25%, AP tests taken per graduate 25%, average SAT and ACT scores 10%, average AP, IB, and AICE scores are 10%, and AP courses offered is 5%. East High School ranked at number 358 on the list of the top 500 schools in America.
Thank you. This is a real honor for Wauwatosa, but most especially Wauwatosa East High School, and we commend each and every one of them for this recognition. Would anyone else like to say anything on this? No? Okay, thank you. Student services, please, Mrs. Muehlfeld.
Yes. It is recommended that the school board approve the contract for the 2011-2012 school year between CISA 1 and the district for services and personnel totaling $153,548.71, and I so move.
Is there a second?
Second?
Thank you, Mrs. Randall. Any comment, please? Yes.
I would just ask that administration give us some indication, and for the public as well, as to how this relates to last year's contract amount.
Am I on? Okay. Yeah, CISA number 1 agreed this year to freeze their prices, so we did not make any changes to our contract, and they did not subject us to any increases in their service costs. So it's the same, if not a little bit less, if there might have been an elimination of something.
Thank you.
Sure.
Do I understand then we will be receiving the same services from CISA as we have in the past?
That's correct.
Any further comment, please? Is there anyone in the public that would like to speak on this item? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mrs. Fee?
Yes.
Mr. Giroux?
Yes.
Mr. Croner?
Yes.
Mr. Meyer?
Yes.
Mrs. Muehlfeld?
Yes.
Mrs. Randall?
Yes.
Mrs. Weber?
Yes. Superintendent, Michael, would you please read the two items?
Item 1, it is recommended that the school board approve renewal membership dues for the Wisconsin Association of School Boards, WASB, for the 2011 to 2012 school year at a cost of $9,146. Item 2, it is recommended that the school board approve the school district of Wauwatosa as a member of the Southeastern Wisconsin School Alliance, participating in retaining DeWitt, Ross, and Stevens SC for the period of July 1, 2011 through June 30, 2012, as legislative council on a cooperative basis with the other school districts that are members of the Alliance, regarding matters of mutual interest as determined by the Alliance, including, but not limited to, constitutional limitations on and legislative decisions related to funding for education, research, public awareness, and information sharing at a cost of $3,000, and I so move.
Is there a second?
Second?
Thank you. Yes.
Madam
Mrs.
President, I would ask that there be separate action on these two items.
Is that agreeable to board members, please? Okay. May we do number 1 first?
Yes, I have no objection to there being joint discussion. I would just ask for
Okay.
separate votes.
Okay, thank you then. Does anyone have any comment on either one of the items or questions? Mrs. Fee?
Thank you. I would just ask that the administration outline why it is recommended that we maintain these memberships. I have specific questions about whether or not the Southeastern Wisconsin School Alliance is a wise association for us to maintain. I am not certain that our interests are necessarily aligned with the other schools, and I'm concerned about paying someone to, that we might possibly be engaging in hiring someone to advocate against our interests. So I'm interested in why the administration recommends that we continue these associations.
Well, with the School Board Association, I think one key component for this coming year is the fact when we move away from Neola, their Policy Services Department, which is a pretty solid resource for us, I think is something that we're going to need. The other piece, I think we've gotten as a district more involved in WASB and have a stronger voice, and I think it would be important to continue with that. Also, I know they do offer a lot of different seminars and workshops, and the joint convention they're part of in Milwaukee as well. I know Mr. Giroux went to a new board member workshop, and I think the advocacy for the school board as well is important. Southeastern Wisconsin School Alliance, it's one that I have struggled with in the past, and I think that the one piece I think that's important, the advocacy of this group is only based upon issues that the entire group comes to an agreement on. And there's a lot of discussions about that, and one of my biggest concerns is there hasn't been that many issues that everybody has come to an agreement on. But I think probably more importantly this year than any other year, and I guess to see where it's going to go forward from here, but I think there's a lot more now that all of the interests can, or all of the districts can rally around and be supportive for legislative action. And I think, I guess that's what kind of turned me to say, yes, we should stay involved with them for another year.
Thank you.
Is there further question or comment? May I suggest that we continue to look for the positives and negative in both of those, and that as we vote on this a year from now, we have some concrete thoughts on it, what merit does it have for us to continue a membership in this? Is there any public comment on these two items? Seeing none, may we vote, roll call vote on number 1, the WASB membership first.
Mrs. Fee?
Yes.
Mr. Droz?
Yes.
Mr. Croner?
Yes.
Mr. Meyer?
Yes.
Mrs. Muehlfeld?
Yes.
Mrs. Randall?
Yes.
Mrs. Weber?
Yes. Now we, number 2, the School Alliance, please.
Mrs. Fee?
No.
Mr. Droz?
Yes.
Mr. Croner?
Yes.
Mr. Meyer?
Yes.
Mrs. Muehlfeld?
Yes.
Mrs. Randall?
Yes.
Mrs. Weber?
Yes. Thank you. Reports to the Board of Business Services, please. I believe Mr. Mack is going to.
Yes, I just have a fund balance policy change, and this was necessitated by a ruling from GASB, which is the Government Accounting Standard Board, and they're implementing statement number 54. Obviously, we don't have a choice with this. This is just something that we have to adhere to. Basically, what they're doing is just recategorizing the way we can state our different fund balance pieces. Is it a gigantic big deal? No. But there is one piece on here that I disagreed with the GASB ruling, trying to get through not only I but many other school districts, and that is that the fund balance that we reserve for cash flow purposes, so we don't have to short-term borrow, has to be categorized. We don't have a choice under unassigned fund balance, and that struck me as odd. I sometimes wonder if the GASB board that made this decision understands the difference between the school, say a school district in a city, where the school district's revenue stream and expenditure stream has different timing, and that's why we reserve the fund balance, because our fiscal year does not coincide with our tax year. So really, it's not that big of a change. What's going to happen is things that perhaps were reserved on our formal financial statements will now be restricted. And then what else I see happening is if something was unreserved and designated, it will be, quote, assigned. These are just technical differences. And then the one bigger difference will be the money that we have to avoid short-term borrowing, and that's that sentence that you see that was added under E, unassigned fund balances. The board discourages the maintenance of unassigned fund balances except for amounts needed to avoid short-term borrowing. And that protects us then from people thinking we're holding that money for some reason other than that purpose. And then what I do in a financial statement is simply, I will actually explain the unassigned fund balance being used for short-term borrowing, and I will actually use the old term that they used to use, and I would just say it's reserved for cash flow purposes and to avoid short-term borrowing. So is this a huge thing? No, it's actually just required by GASB. I have to follow exactly what they want, and it really is nothing but a formality of them reassigning how they designate the fund balances. I mean, in the past we had reserved fund balance, unreserved designated, and unreserved undesignated. So the reserved will go to basically restricted, and that simply would be like where we pay for our capital improvements, that's restricted, and it is restricted even now. If we had debt service, it would be restricted for debt service payment now, and it really is. Instead of just saying designated, it's going to be saying it's restricted. The only difference really is in the general fund, anything that we're going to use for cash flow purposes will have to be designated unassigned formally on the financial statements, but then I will explain it in a special note in the financial statements that the reason for it is to reserve the money to avoid short-term borrowing. That's really all that's here.
Board members, any questions? Yes, Mrs. Randall?
Is it possible, John, for you to put this into a situation? In other words, going forward, if, say, we would want to initiate a referendum or something, does this have anything to do with that?
No, that wouldn't have anything to do with this
Okay.
whatsoever. This is just how you designate at the end of the year. Really, if you have funds, I guess the whole thing is, but to me, it's not much difference from what we had, that the public is aware of the intended purpose of the money. So, but it was, to me, the difference between from what we had and what we're going to, there's not much of a change there. In fact, I find it rather redundant that they even went through all of this work to do this. I'm not sure the value of it, but it is what it is, and we have to do it. It's really actually it's not a big deal to do it at all, because basically I know where to put everything. Pretty much everything that was, like I said, reserved is going to be restricted, and in a general fund it's either going to be assigned for a specific use, or the balance that is not used will be unassigned, but then I will say it's reserved and explain that it's used for cash flow purposes in the following year.
Okay, and then the statement, the board discourages the maintenance of unassigned fund balances, et cetera, that you created that statement?
I
for our
created that
district.
statement, and actually I created it with the assistance of our auditor,
Okay.
because they knew that we're not the only school district that has a situation of this nature. I talked to a number of school districts. A lot of us don't understand, because to me, what I wanted to do with this is I said, well, I can just assign it as for fund balance, and they said, no, you can't do that. No one ever gave me a reason why, though. No, there's no reasoning out there of why you can't assign it. And trying to get through to a GASB board might be something like testifying in front of Congress. So it's just one of those things. I accept it, and we basically said, we'll put this footnote, adjust the policy with that statement, and then I will explain it in the financial statements. And that's what pretty much all of their clients are going to do.
Okay, thanks.
Further questions or comments? Seeing none, is there any public comment? Thank you, Mr. Mack. You always make things very clear. Thank you. Student learning. It's a pleasure to introduce Jeff Kiernan, principal of Whitman School.
Well, tonight we have Mr. Kiernan, Ms. Patton here. They have been leading the charge with the Secondary Scheduling Committee. The Secondary Scheduling Committee goes back a number of years, and we kind of put a stop to it after a period of time where we didn't see the kind of progress we were making, and the two of these two administrators took over the lead on it, and we've made some progress in the past year and intend to bring something forward to the board this school year for implementation for 2012-2013. Obviously, since they undertook their work, there's been some changes with collective bargaining, with the addition of the Spanish program being approved, so that has an impact on 6th grade, and some other pieces that are going to have to be incorporated into the work. So I'll stop there and let you guys talk.
All right, thank you for letting us report out on some exciting work that's been completed over the past year by a pretty large committee made up of secondary teachers, central office administration, and eventually we'll have parents involved in this process too. We have, on average, between 25 and 35 people attend our committee meetings, so it is kind of interesting facilitating a group that size. In your packet, you'll see a couple of things that we would like to highlight tonight and review with you on some of the things that we've accomplished over the past year and where we're headed in the future. I'll just kind of read the bulleted points to you as far as work accomplished this past year. The first thing we obviously did with a group this size was sit down, Lean and I, and kind of define the purpose of the committee. Prior to meeting with the committee, we met with Dr. Ertl and the directors and kind of outlined exactly what Dr. Ertl and the directors wished us to accomplish, working with the secondary teachers and looking at scheduling options. So we talked to the committee, as Dr. Ertl had said. The committee had started and stopped a few times, and so one of our jobs was to create a cohesive team and create an understanding that we were going to move forward, create some momentum, and actually start accomplishing and moving in a direction where people could see kind of the light at the end of the tunnel. We also talked about how we were going to make decisions on the committee. I think the board is familiar, or some board members are familiar, and we'll walk through the Kettner-Trago decision-making process that we are using. So we explained that to all the committee members so that people clearly understood how we were going to make decisions. I think that's an important piece so that, again, people are not taken by surprise, and that they have a voice in the direction that we are going. We were fortunate to be able to attend a conference on scheduling, and so we talked about people participating in that in the CISA 4 district up by La Crosse. They had brought in a scheduling expert from the East Coast, and there was a couple of teachers and myself that attended and listened to him, and we found him to be very engaging and very helpful, and we were fortunate that he was available. He was consulting in another district, and we just met with him June 17th, about a month ago. So our entire committee actually got to hear him and participate in some conversations with him related to scheduling, some of the trends that are happening across the country, and some of the things that he sees going on. And he's been a very valuable resource to us. We talked about communication back to the individual sites, departments, buildings, and how critical that was. Because this is a massive undertaking if we're looking at potential changes in the schedule, so that everybody was on board, and that with a group of 30 to 35 people, that it's necessary to go back and communicate and get feedback and input from a variety of people back in the buildings. We also discussed what work needed to be completed in the buildings. Not all the work could be done by the committee, so some of the work had to be completed back in the buildings. We talked about how we were going to begin evaluating specific scheduling options when the appropriate time came in place, appropriate timelines for this past year, and we are meeting as a committee again on Wednesday the 20th to go over timelines for the coming school year. So we established timelines that we tried to adhere to the last school year, and we're going to meet again, as I said, July 20th to come up with some new timelines. I think that was important from a committee's perspective, because it gave targets for us to shoot for. As Dr. Ertl again said, there was some stopping and starting in the past of this committee, so outlining what we were trying to accomplish and the timeline to do that helped create that cohesive team that we need in making this decision. Once we make some evaluations and we come up with some top choices, potential scheduling options. There will be some school visitations involved so that we can directly observe some of the things that we would like to implement here. And that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about in our future meetings. We also need to talk about how we're going to communicate to the public once we get to the point where we're evaluating potential options and we choose an option for both the high school and middle school. We certainly want to make sure that the public is very clear on how we went about this and how we evaluated things and why we're moving in the direction that we are. And then lastly, once we make a choice for a schedule, We have to talk about what professional development opportunities are needed for staff so that they're very comfortable with any changes that occur, and that they have the skills necessary to make sure that we are successful. So that's some of the things that we've done. There's just some short verbiage. Purpose of the committee is to determine a structure or schedule that the district curriculum can be delivered in the secondary schools. This committee is not determining specific course selections. And I think that's been good for our group so that we have not become territorial in protecting specific classes. We're going to design a structure, and then we can put classes within that structure. And that's opened up the thinking of the committee, and it's been very valuable. Explanation of decision-making process. You'll see in the, if you flip to this chart right here for board members who are not familiar with this process, we have walked the board through some of this in the past for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, specifically to this building. And so this sheet kind of discusses it, and this sheet right here, the next sheet, lists the steps. And so the steps we are following as a group, and again, we educated the committee on this, is to state the decision. And the decision that we are trying to make as a committee is to, we will select, recommend the schedule that best accomplishes district goals, enables the curriculum to be taught, and meets the student needs at the middle and high school level. So again, everybody's clear on what we're trying to do. So that's the first step in the process. And as a group, we came up with a variety of decision statements, and when you're working group work, massage it, the language, and everybody supported what we were trying to do. The next step in the process is to establish and classify objectives. And you'll see in your packet there's some matrices that look like this. And you'll see the first one, there's multiple objectives. We probably had 45 objectives that we generated as a group. And then we started paring those down, and we started talking as a group what exactly we were wishing to accomplish. And our first go-around, we came up with this matrix right here. And then our committee members took this back to their various groups and bounced these objectives off of the various people that they were in charge of communicating with. So it was departments, it was grade levels, it was teams, and they received feedback on this. And I
just want to interject too that the objectives were very extensive because the committee members went back and they got objectives from all of their staff members from their selected buildings and stuff. We kind of broke them up into departments, and they went back and talked to their department specifically, and then generated a huge list of objectives. We took the district objectives too as well, and then we combined those, and this is how we came up with this comprehensive list. So it was very transparent, and we did get input from all the secondary schools. Everybody had the opportunity to give their input, as well as the district objectives that came from Dr. Ertl as well.
And so from there, as Lena said, we received feedback both as a committee as facilitators. We kind of modified the objectives a little bit, and that'll be your second sheet. And the next step in the process is to classify or weight those objectives. And we started off with high, medium, and low weights instead of giving them numbers. And this helped, again, help people with a pattern of thinking of what they thought should be considered to a greater degree. All of our objectives are important. I don't want to minimize any of them, but some of them carry a little greater weight. And so we started out with high, medium, and low. Again, when you're facilitating 30 people, we didn't want people to get hung up on numeric number. And so this reflected a pattern of thinking. And again, it was taken back, as Lena shared, to the individual sites, and feedback was sought from as many people as we could get. From there, everybody agreed that was a good pattern of thinking, and we deviated just a little bit because some of the objectives were specific to high school and middle school. And so we eventually got to the point where we were able to weight high school and middle school objectives. And you'll see that in the third matrix that is in your packet. And so that's what we're going to use to evaluate options as we move forward. And it doesn't look like a lot of work when you see this document, but it is it was a critical piece to get really what criteria we're going to use to make this important decision. And so there was a lot of discussion, very healthy discussion, both within all the sites and as a committee as a whole. And there were times that we broke up into a middle school committee and a high school committee because sometimes the needs are a little bit different at the different levels. And so we feel pretty good, and I think as facilitators we feel good, and I think the committee feels good that there's been the discussion put forward in the criteria we're going to use, and everybody's very clear on the criteria we're going to use, and it takes out some of the subjectivity when we're trying to make an objective decision here.
And one other thing, one of the things too that we began the committee meetings with is with the understanding of there is no perfect schedule, and that you have to give up something to get something. And so that's kind of where also the waiting took place, was that, you know, we may not be able to have everything that we want. And so we need to kind of, at some point, we might have to make some decisions, because there might be some conflictual things that might take place trying to get, you know, one objective at the expense of another one too as well. So that was very, I think, freeing for a lot of people too, to understand that too as well. And we haven't crossed that bridge yet where we've eliminated certain objectives. Right now we're just kind of looking at all of them and trying to get as many as we can met, but using the weighting system to kind of look at which ones do we feel, you know, we need to have this. This is a non-negotiable. This is what needs to be in our schedule and has to be in our schedule, and have those discussions as to why is that versus maybe another objective that could either be there or not there.
So now, we are, as I said, we're meeting this Wednesday, and our next step in the process is to list options and then begin evaluating options. And our meeting June 17th with Dr. Reddick gave us the opportunities to start looking at all of the options, or multiple options, many options that are out there. And he also gave us some directions on, as I said, some trends that are happening, maybe some things that our committee we're very interested in. One of the things that we're looking at is some type of intervention period. And so he was able to kind of show us some models that had intervention periods in them. So we're going to process that, and we're going to start looking at options and using our criteria to evaluate options. After we evaluate options, we need to make a decision and consider the risks associated with making that decisions. And certainly, you can see, trust your work and pick a winner. And we certainly want to pick a winner both at the high school and middle school level. Also enclosed in your packet, again, it's a PowerPoint that Dr. Reddick shared pieces of with us. He didn't go through this entire PowerPoint, but we thought it was important for the board to see this PowerPoint, to look at it at your leisure, so that you can understand kind of the complexity that there is behind the scheduling models that are out there, and that it is a big decision for us as a district, as individual sites. And that's why we think it's very valuable that we have such a large committee, and that we're doing a very thorough job on trying to use a decision-making process, and making sure that, as Lena said, that our discussions are very transparent, very open, and involve a lot of people. Also in your packet, you'll see, again, I don't want to portray that any of these options are, this is just an example of some of the options that he gave us. And again, I think it just will enlighten you that there are a lot of schedule options available to us. And that's why our next meetings are going to be very critical, that we take a look at these options as we begin evaluating where we want to go, and try and come up with a top 2 or a top 3, so we can do some site visitations before we make that final decision. I think that's about all I have to share. If there's anything else, Lena, you have to share. I would just like to compliment the teachers that are involved, and the central office administrators who are involved in this committee. As Lena said, I think as time has gone on, people have become more global thinkers. I think we started off where people were coming in trying to protect a little bit, which is normal and natural. Anytime there's change, and the change of a schedule could negatively impact your department or your course offering, I think you're going to become protective. And as Lena said, I think as time has gone on, people have become more global thinkers, and that's a credit to the committee. People have been working very hard. They've given up some classroom time and stayed late into some evenings. I'd like to thank central office's support when we approached Dr. Ertl about bringing in the consultant to the district. He happened to be in Black River Falls, and we could share expenses with them. Dr. Ertl was very supportive and said this is an opportunity, let's take advantage of it. So, and then lastly, we'd like to thank your support that you're interested in the work we're doing, and that we can communicate progress to date. So I guess we'll try and entertain any questions.
Before
at
I
this point.
introduce questions, I'd like to apologize to Lena. I didn't know you were a part of the presentation tonight, so we heartily welcome you too. And then may I ask, you said 25 to 30. That's all areas within the secondary schools?
Correct.
And do most people attend all the meetings, or do you break it down somewhat?
No, we have about 25, 30 that attend on a regular basis. So it's a pretty large group.
One more question. When is the decision do you hope that you might bring forward? Do you have any idea?
We're thinking, again, we're going to discuss timeline on Wednesday, and Mr. Chanin was at our last meeting, and we talked a little bit about timeline. We're hoping the end of October, the beginning of November, that we would have some pretty distinct, here's the direction we're going. And so, we're saying here's a scheduling model that we need to try and pilot and try and talk about what we need to accomplish. We understand we're under the gun a little bit with course selection catalogs and some of those things. So we're thinking end of October, beginning of November. Again, we'll talk with the committee, but I think that's what we talked about at our last meeting, correct,
Yeah,
Mr. Chanin?
at the latest.
At the latest, yes. So,
Okay. Board members, questions or comments, please? Mrs. Randall, and then Mrs. Fee.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I do know you've taken on a big responsibility, and so thanks. I have two different questions. Some of the objectives here would lend themselves to data-driven decisions. Specifically, teachers maintain the same students for the full duration of the course. Did you look at research or other districts or reasons that would say that's a good idea or a bad idea? Or did we use, our internal?
yeah, I think, and Lena can fill in any gaps that I miss on this, because it certainly was a high school-driven objective. This past year, some students changed teachers at semesters. And I think one of the things that we talked about at length as a committee is that teachers start to really get to know their students, their learning styles, with the addition of MAPS testing the last year, and all the things that MAPS enables teachers to do at looking at student deficiencies and differentiating curriculum within that classroom. We just thought it was very important that once teachers understand students, that they get the opportunity to work with them throughout the year, especially with all the PLC work that's going on, formative assessments, driving instruction. And then, so that's one piece of it. And the second piece of that is that relationship between that student and that teacher is certainly critical for that success. And so I think teachers felt very strongly that with the PLC work and the relationship piece, that they want to have that student the entire year. They don't want them going from one English 9 teacher to a different English 9 teacher.
And I think as a district, the utilization of MAPS data, that's very key, because we test at least 2 to 3 times a year. And so to see that growth target, or to see that consistency with instruction of students to either help with teacher instruction so they can improve, it's more valid than if you have a kid first semester, then you change a kid second semester, and they have different teachers. And so we looked at that as being a real key thing too.
And I know we just hired the data manager, and I'm hoping that this would be a place where you could tap into whatever, like I said, to get some, real information. The other thing, district initiatives or district development plans. Could you just talk a little bit specifically about what you took from that, from district goals?
Sure. I think a couple things. One, we're looking at, and I'll speak for kind of the middle school, the expansion of an opportunity for language arts or English reading specifically, and math. Is there an opportunity with the schedule change to provide a greater amount of time for instructional needs? Also, I think at both levels, intervention periods. And when you talk intervention periods, certainly students who may need additional support to be successful, but also students who are very successful and need to be challenged. And so one of the things that has been discussed at great length is the need for an intervention period at some point in the day to accomplish those goals. And I think that, again, directly relates to some district initiatives to challenge both ends of the spectrum and to make sure that all students are successful.
Then I think you'll see that one of the goals that got weighted pretty high for both middle and high school was to maximize opportunities for students' choice regarding course selection, the ability to select more courses, as one of the initiatives at the high school level is to increase the number of AP courses that, or to increase the number of students that are enrolled in AP courses, and that kind of allots for that, where they're able to take, a more variety of courses as well as include AP courses in their schedules. And then going back to kind of what Jeff said about the interventions, to looking at opportunities for us to improve on our WKC scores in the areas of math and English, as we've talked about, as well as students meeting their target growth in MAPS, with keeping that continuity with teachers and working with teachers to help students meet those target growth and being more consistent in that. So.
Okay. One more, Mrs.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of hard to phrase, but the structure of the schedule enables teachers of the same content area to meet during the school day, common planning time. How do you not portray that as being a teacher need as opposed to a student need? And I guess I'm going to be real frank with the words during the school day
Sure.
in there, because those questions we know we will get.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we talked about, again, it goes back to our district looking and really making great strides with PLCs and staff development, and looking at formative assessments, that we're trying to create an opportunity for common teachers of the same subject to be able to meet, to compare that data during the day, right as they're teaching, so that they can formulate instructional strategies during that time and implement those in the classroom. So it's one of our objectives. To what degree we're going to be able to accomplish that, we'll see once we start looking at scheduling options. I think another piece of that, and again, I'll reflect on some middle school discussions that we had, teachers at the middle school level thought that piece was more critical than necessarily keeping kids in the same house or team. If we have to give something up to get something, we could give up some of that cross-house idea for some flexibility. But if they can still meet to talk about student progress, student needs, that was considered more important.
Sorry.
Will you expect the PLC process to evolve into one where, it would, instead of having more all building meetings or all department meetings, you would have more of these small group planning times? Or
I think that any time that you can allot more opportunity or time for teachers to meet and look at data and analyze student work and, look at things like that, that's going to help drive instruction. It's just going to improve, academic success of students. And I understand that there's a professional expectation that they do that outside of what we kind of offer anyway. I know as a teacher, that's something that I partake in, outside of whatever schedule time that you have. But I think that as a district, whatever opportunities and additional time that we can allot for teachers to look at this, look at the data and the work and stuff like that, will definitely just improve the academic success of our students. So, I mean, yes, we have the PLC time that once a week, but just if you look at that and multiply it times 5, you know, if we do this every day, I mean, just the gains that we can make as a district, I think would just be incredible.
Okay.
And again, not to push any specific option, but again, Dr. Riddick was able to show us an intervention period on a rotating schedule that allowed departments to meet during that intervention time. And so
Right.
math people could meet once a week, and then they would provide math support the rest of the week, but it gave them time, you know, in the English department.
Right.
And the students were selecting, and so it gave them some responsibility, and it was very interesting. There were multiple win-win scenarios in that particular model, and so
Yeah.
that's where we started thinking along those lines.
Yeah, I'm just anticipating.
Sure.
Thank you.
Just, if I can just comment on that too, I think another piece, again, as changes have come through, the definition of school day and what the workday, I think, plays into that as well. I know some districts around the state have already taken some steps to increase collaboration time. Hasn't been overly popular the way it's been done, but I think that's something the board's gonna have to wrestle with in how we define what the workday is, what the school day is too. So that plays into this as well.
Mrs. P?
Thank you. And thank you. I'd echo what my colleagues have said about taking on a tough job, and I do appreciate that you are taking this on and sort of corralling a very large committee, which I'm sure is sometimes difficult. I would like to address first who is on that committee. You've mentioned teachers. Are there any counselors who are currently involved in the scheduling?
Yes.
Brian Hoffman and
Don Devine and Sue Ennis.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that the people who are currently involved in this were there as well. And I'm sorry if I'm a little disjointed. I have a lot of thoughts about this subject, and they're kind of all over the place. So it sounds from your comments that there's already been a decision made that we're not going to continue with the scheduling that we have. Is it possible that you're going to come back with deciding that what we need to do is tweak the system that we have as opposed to throwing it out and starting new with a different one?
Well, when we looked at it, there's an array of different schedules that are out there, and the 7-day period as we have it now is one of the options on the table, and that'll be used against the weighting system to see which one, you know, out of the however many schedules that we come up with, maybe that is the best schedule. So that's not an option that's not on the table. So that option is on the table just as well as any other options are on the table. I don't know if that
Okay, it does. I just, from the comments, it sounded like we're going to have a change. And I want to make sure that we're not changing for change's sake.
No.
That there's an examination as to, obviously there are problems with the schedule. I have 2 middle schoolers, they're coming to light as we proceed through the years. I get that there are problems. But I just want I want to be sure that we're not just going to change it because we feel like we need to do something big and dramatic. And that there is going to be an evaluation of whether we could make minor changes, for perhaps ideas from some of these other systems, to our current schedule, if that would be best for our district. I do want to go to the weighting that you talked about because I'm having trouble reconciling 2 of these. They are minimize the number of hard student conflicts and maximize opportunities for student choice. I was dismayed to find out this spring that while the board approved a new program for middle school, the Project Lead the Way program, the robotics class, which is a great opportunity for our middle school students, any middle school student, or at least a 7th grader who chose to take a foreign language, was automatically precluded from taking that class. And that's not something that's beneficial to our students. So I'm somewhat confused as to how maximizing choices can be the highest priority and minimizing conflicts can be the lowest priority, because it doesn't really do our students any good to give them all these choices if they can't choose them. So can you just take me through exactly how those 2 ended up at the top and the bottom, when they seem to be something that needs to travel together?
Sure. As a committee, we talked about that, and when we talked about hard student conflicts, you just described a hard student conflict, where there's no way around that. And the number of those are not percentage that, it's not a great percentage of kids now. And so, as Lena said, there is no perfect schedule. And so when we started looking at minimizing the number of hard student conflicts, we talked about that there is gonna be hard student conflicts in any schedule we create. And so we had that rated very high initially, and we said it's unavoidable. So that's what we're
I understand it is. It just, as a board member, when we're asked to approve new programs, there's sort of an assumption that the students are going to be able to take them. And it's problematic for me to dedicate resources to a class that a large percentage of students are going to be excluded from because they have to make another choice. So that's why I was just curious as to how it ended up that way.
And I think that part of the discussion too is, if my memory serves me correctly, is that we kind of felt like if we created a schedule that, or not created one, but offered a schedule that maximized the opportunity for student choices, that the hard conflicts, it would kind of resolve itself. So that the minimizing the hard conflicts is not such a priority, because if we could provide this opportunity for students to take more classes, that the one would kind of balance out the other, in a sense. I mean, of course, there are going to be some. I mean, you're never going to be able to get around that. But if you can produce a schedule, like kind of like you said in the beginning, they kind of both go in the same hand. So if you're kind of producing more opportunities for kids to take more choices, and you really do create or offer a schedule that offers that, then the conflicts aren't going to be there, because they're going to have more choices. Obviously, they can't be both. So I think that was kind of my understanding, and that's why we didn't.
I think the other piece of that is, part of the discussion was, students are making choices right now. If I choose, as you indicated, foreign language, music, and then if I, as opposite, my allied arts periods are taken up at the middle school level, I've made that choice. That's the choice I've made. And there are other electives out there, but I've chosen to go that route. And so, you did have a choice. You made the choice of the foreign language, music, Phi-Ed. Now, Phi-Ed's not an option. It's legally you have to take it. But band is an option, and the foreign language is an option. And if you choose those options, and so whatever we create, if we create more choices, people are going to have to make those choices.
Mm-hmm.
And you're
Certainly.
making those choices. Does that sometimes eliminate other choices? Yes.
I'm simply looking at it, trying very hard to put aside my parental perspective and looking at it as a board member, that it's now a factor that I have to consider when a new program is brought forward. How is this going to fit into the schedule? And is this going to force choices that we don't want to make students have to choose? So I appreciate the insight into how that was reached.
And I think it's that, I'm sorry, we're not, you're not trying to eliminate, we're just trying to decrease the number that we have now. And so that's the whole, I think, just.
And just one last question for now. The middle school wait for students having a home base during the school day is relatively high, to 7. Is it in the purview of your committee to decide what happens in home base, or how that time is used, or simply that it fits into the schedule?
I think we were talking about some kind of advisor period. Is that 15 minutes, half hour? We haven't decided that yet. And then another group of people to talk about, okay, exactly, if it's a 10-minute, half hour, what would we do to that, depending on what options selected. So we haven't gotten to that.
Okay, thank you.
And then I think also was rated high, depending on whether or not, with understanding how important relationships are, if the house concept didn't stay or didn't remain for whatever reason, that having that advisory on a daily basis in the middle school would be very beneficial, because they wouldn't have that, that family or that relationship intense building as they would if it was in a house concept. So I think that's where sort of that weight went to. So if the house concept remained, then they necessarily said the weight may not be as large as if the house concept does go away.
Okay.
If you have to give up something.
So that's a little fluid right now.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Mayor?
If I had to vote on this right now, I'd vote no. Your process is flawed because you only have one set of stakeholders in the room. which is the employees. And they've done a wonderful job, and bless them all, but you don't have other stakeholders in the room. And your plan is to have one set of stakeholders, the employees, figure things out, and then bring the other stakeholders in to ratify what's been done, and maybe to tweak it. So, for example, the school board as a stakeholder, one of our big deals is finances. We've been told in budget discussions from the superintendent that the junior high model will save us hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. As school board as stakeholders, that's a big deal. The junior high model isn't listed here as a considered model in this weighting. So you've gone down all this road, and an option that looks, I'm not saying the board would do it, but it's a very attractive option because of the number of teachers it would allow us to retain. And to somehow bring that in at the end of your process and try to recalibrate everything doesn't seem like the way you are wanting to operate. So without the board as stakeholders at the table, not that you want us all there, but no, none of us want all of us there, but that factor isn't there. According to that, and it was Dr. Ertl's words that said this many hundreds of dollars if we go from a middle school to a junior high model, that isn't here. But by the board as stakeholders, it needs to be there, at least for me. And not,
If I could just
yeah.
interject
Oh,
there.
but I'm not done yet.
Okay.
And another factor is that the students and the parents are not in at the ground floor. And we've had people come to the microphone who say minimize hard conflicts is a big deal, who say high school opportunities for middle school students is a big deal. And to say, you know, and this, as I'm seeing these numbers, these are our values. They don't say what the cost and the possibilities are. So it's not consistent for you to say, well, you know, we want to minimize hard conflicts, but there will always be some hard conflicts, so we give this a 1, which is the lowest possible score, when we have parents of high-performing students who come to us and say, that's a high value. So I would think if those parents were in the room with you right at the beginning, those ones for minimize the number of hard conflicts would be a lot higher. And then we'd have to weight it against the cost. But what you've done is kind of a classic, you know, not enough stakeholders in the room, and you're going to have this wonderful product from your perspective. And we see this all the time when Dr. Earl comes and proposes something and the room explodes with 100 people in it. Well, that's how that happens. So I'm not negative about the work you've done, because I've benefited from, Mr. Kiernan, your work about the Fisher Building, and I've seen the good things you can do. But I think for your process, you need to bring the other stakeholders in at the early steps so that these numbers reflect that, so you don't have to try to like reinvent the calibration at the very end of the deal, and then your people become, your employee group, those stakeholders become disillusioned because they won't have a chance to be brought along with the input of the other stakeholders, and they'll be all disappointed, which won't be fair because they've done a lot of good things and invested a lot of time. So that's what I'd say. These other stakeholders need to be brought in as soon as possible, so these numbers from the get-go can have that calibration to reflect what they're doing. And it won't be happy. You know that. You're literally a pro at doing this kind of thing. So wonderful work, but those stakeholders, I think, need to be brought in early on. You know, get the junior high column in here, because we know it's coming. We know that choice is coming, but we won't have had a chance to get your input on the junior high model, because it wasn't offered to your committee as a choice. And that won't be fair to your committee's input, because you won't be a stakeholder at the table when that choice is put there either.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, none of the options are listed across the top right now. And certainly a junior high option can be listed. that's one of the things that we're gonna start working on the 20th.
Okay.
So it's not that the junior
Yeah.
high model is eliminated right now. There are no, as you see, there's no block on top, there's no mod on top, there's no, none of the options are listed because we haven't gotten to that point yet.
Okay.
So the junior high is not an objective, it's a choice, and we haven't listed any of the choices yet. So that's a piece.
I was going to say, I think the piece that the house concept was not prioritized. The main component of a middle school schedule is that house.
Right.
That's where you get the conflicts and all those other pieces. So that's really not a priority or not an objective. So I think it's set up that if the junior high model were
It's gonna be
the best,
evaluated.
yeah.
And I would totally agree, certainly, I can talk with Dr. Ertl. If the school board member wants to be part of the process, we have no problems with that at all. I agree, you're a stakeholder in that, so we can certainly work with Dr. Ertl on that, and we can figure that out. And as far as the parent piece, we've talked about that, and one of the reasons we didn't involve parents from the get-go, from the ground floor, I think it would have been certainly beneficial, but as a committee, we had to kind of get our act together, per se, because there has been a number of starts and stops. We did have some skepticism, I'll be honest with you, to overcome. People said this committee has been in existence for a long time. We've done some things. I think at one point there were some parents involved, and then nothing happened. And when nothing happens, you know how people get, oh, here we go, another committee, nothing's going to happen. The other piece that we talked about was we didn't want to have necessarily people from outside the organization in the process too fast if people had to really share some of their insights and feelings and perceptions. I always say there's some things that you keep in the family. And so I think we've overcome those things, and I think it's an appropriate time now that we have our act together. And if we have other stakeholders in that, they will see that we have our act together. We needed to get our act together.
And those stakeholders, like especially the school board, I don't want to be in the room with you all because I don't want to inhibit your conversations either. But you need to understand that it won't be fair to your process, to the work you've done, is if at the 11th hour some overriding factor is going to come in, like, oh, we're this many hundreds of $1,000s we need to find to cut from somewhere, and you all haven't had a chance to contribute to the conversation to say, if that's a given, that money has to be cut or some other financial consideration brought into play, what's your input to evolve the process when that's a factor? But if the 11th hour thing comes in and you are all done and, you won't have, it won't be as good a result. You know that. I'm not telling you anything because you're the expert in this. You know what I'm saying, though, about that we get all those factors in early and not necessarily, I don't want to be in the room. I won't help you, Thanks.
Okay. Mr. Croner?
Thank you. I just want to say it's very, very helpful to have you here explaining this to us, because knowing how the decision is going to be made, having confidence in the process really helps us evaluate it later and support what comes out of the committee. So I hope that we can do more of this for big projects in the future. I wanted to follow up what Mr. Meyer said about parent involvement, because this conversation took me back to the long-range planning process when I served on the curriculum committee. And one thing that came out of the long-range planning was more parent involvement into the decision-making process. And I can understand how having a small number of parents on the committee might not be representative of the community, but it seems to me that it was a desire of the community to have a role earlier on in these kinds of decisions. And it occurred to me, would there be a way, to publish or do a survey, an online survey of these objectives that you send to all secondary parents or all parents in the district, just to let them rank them. And so if something gets turned upside down compared to what you did, you maybe have to say, wow, the community thinks something very different about this item, and then maybe we have to look at that again or find a way to modify what we're doing. So I think there might be a way to get parental input to see what the community values in a secondary schedule without turning your process upside down, and it might prevent some problems from coming up later. Am I right in assuming you're going to be proposing more than one model, one middle school model, one secondary model? Is that right?
What we're going to provide to the board is the models that we evaluated, and then how we evaluated them against the criteria, so you'll be able to see all of them.
Okay.
But I intend to bring a recommendation to the board for the one model that the administration is recommending. So the committee is going to recommend through administration, but I think to bring it back and use the criteria to show exactly why the one was recommended and why the other ones weren't.
But the two systems in middle school and high school could have different models. I mean, they
Yes.
wouldn't necessarily be the same. Okay. And I was going to go back to what Mrs. Fee said about hard student conflicts. That was a big deal in the long-range planning curriculum committee as well. And I was going to suggest that maybe you just combine those into maximize opportunities and minimize hard conflicts and make that a 10, because I assume you're going to try to balance it. I mean, you're not going to add more opportunities if it also increases hard conflicts. I mean, so maybe combining those two and giving them a high priority would be a way to balance, because I think they do go together, and so you're going to have to balance that out. The other thing that Mr. Meyer talked about that I saw in here in one sheet but not in others is cost. And so I assume that you're going to have to evaluate cost. That's how we're going to have to evaluate it. And there may be a model that fits everything here perfectly, but we can't afford it. Or if we boost our funding a little bit, we can get to where we need to be. Or if we don't have the funding, we can, this model is the one that fits our needs. So I think it will be helpful to somewhere in this decision tree, you're going to have a column of cost and make that a high priority, because obviously that impacts how we have to make the decision.
There were certain things that were like non-negotiables, like certain things that had to meet, whether it was state standards or, whatever the state mandates, or certain things that have to be in place as far as like how long classes have to be for credits to be given, or the fiscal responsibility. There were certain things that we didn't put on here because they were just, we couldn't go outside those parameters with, we understood that we couldn't go outside of some of the parameters because we didn't have
Sure.
a choice as a committee. That wasn't a decision for us to even wait.
But I mean, there may be a model that's our second best choice according to all the weighting, but it saves us $700,000 a year. I mean, so that has to be factored in also. And I was going to say, with all the changes in the state in the past year, there are new variables. For example, the structure of the day is a variable. So for example, two models, one might weight out higher than the other, but if you say, well, if we lengthen the day by 30 minutes or an hour, this model would win. And so I hope that now that flexibility is there, that's also going to be a consideration, that the flexibility in how this day is structured could be a factor in how the models play out. If we're going to keep the same structure, this model is the best option, but if we can modify the day, this one might come forward. So I hope that's there.
Committee members are very aware of that.
And I was another very important thing from the curriculum committee was, making sure that we provide education for all the students. And therefore, I was happy to see that the intervention plan was near the top, because I don't think we do enough intervention for the struggling students. So I hope that remains a high priority, and that can be something that fits into the regular day, because I've been trying to figure out how we could afford to reach every struggling student in the district, and right now there's not a way to do that. So I'm glad to see that there, and I hope that works out. But thank you for being here, because it's really helpful for me to see how the decisions are going to be made and to be able to have some input at this point, so we don't get near the end and say, well, why didn't you think of this, or why didn't you think of that? So thank you for coming.
If I can just comment on the cost issue. The cost is clearly, it's based on the number of teachers and how many classes they teach. And regardless of which schedule you have, if we go to an 8-period day, if the board wanted to have the teachers teach 4 of the 8 periods, that's going to cost some extra money. If they want to have them teach 7 of 8, that's going to generate a lot of savings. So when it comes down to it, and I think if you look at any of the models, the cost controls are clearly in the hands of the school board and the decisions you make on teaching load, number of classes that are being taught. So even under our current schedule, 7-period day, teachers teach 5 periods, let's just say at the high school level. That's increased to 6. That generates about $1 million worth of savings at the high school level. So there's I think the board needs to know that you have more control over costs than we ever have before in looking at. So it does free up some things, but it also makes some real challenging decisions on how we move forward. But it is pretty much freed up in that regard.
Karen?
Thank you. I think you've heard some good comments already tonight. It's wonderful. And of course, because the waiting options are the most tangible thing coming out of this group so far, that's what the board's gonna zero in on, so that's, and I think that's helpful to frame the discussion. I'm also very excited about the intervention and enrichment time, and I think it absolutely follows the professional learning community and its extension of it. So the professional learning community, although the end result is to improve student learning and growth and targets, a more student-focused intervention time will tie right into that, which also ties to our mission and the goals that we have set as a district. So I'm very happy to see that, and I can also forward to you some information that I received at the National School Board Association on some districts that have actually built this into their school days that I'm happy to send around. Also, I observed from a higher level some of the concerns that the other board members have articulated very well with the middle school schedule in particular. And I think it speaks, some of the discrepancies really speak to the house model that has become so ingrained over the years in our district. So getting out of that mindset into the new delivery system, whatever that ends up to be, is going to be a challenge. So that's where I see mainly those discrepancies coming from, unless Mr. Kiernan, you can comment more about, as a middle school principal, how those rankings differed so much between the high school and the middle school. That's a little bit what I saw from the 1,000-foot level.
I would just say, I think when we started really dissecting what, I don't want to say what's important, but I applaud the middle school teachers, because I think for years they've really, and I don't think it's a bad thing, the house concept and keeping students, that transition model where they're used to one teacher or two teachers at the elementary level, and then coming to the big bad middle school, they have all these teachers and we need them together, that they were able to think outside of that a little bit, and that's reflected in some of the objectives and how we weighted them. And that was that took multiple meetings to have those discussions, because it is something that people are used to, parents are used to. So just to kind of free up our thinking, as we talked about, took a lot of discussion.
Further board members? Michael?
One small comment, again, as long as we're talking about individual items, the minimized teacher travel. I suspect that's a huge cost to the teachers. It's not so much a district financial cost.
Both.
It's both, but the idea that somebody's not with the kids in the building, that they're going between buildings, so.
We lose instructional time, we lose some of that conferencing time, the relationship building. I know it's a headache for HR. Mr. Chain is over there saying that minimize the number of conflicts that are created through travel. It would be very beneficial for all parties involved.
So as you know, there are trade-offs, and I have every confidence you two are going to lead us through this, like you did, Mr. Kiernan, with the Fisher Building question. And part of that, your process, is to come to us and hear what we have to say. And so I want to highlight that too. That travel thing is not good. Okay.
I agree.
Further comment, please? Yes, Mary Jo?
Just a real quick, I've been thinking a lot since you talked about the choice choices as they pertain to eliminating the conflicts and so on. And I think that's a good thing to keep in the forefront of the discussion as you do bring new people in, because, you know, this isn't going to fix everything, and to create that expectation, and to help people own that yes, no matter what, you still are going to have choices. We hope you have more. We hope you can, you know, come up with a more satisfactory schedule than you had this year or whatever, but it is a big part of it. And I think when you do something this big, people can, you know, have expectations that might not be entirely realistic. So thanks for addressing that, and I think that needs to be out there.
As Lena said, there is not a perfect schedule.
No.
We're going to try and get as close as we can. but
Right,
no perfect
right.
Do you want to talk about the year-round component to it as well? I'm just kidding. We'll leave it at that for now.
Is there community comment, please? Seeing none, both Lena and Jeff, this has been very, very exciting, and a lot of work has gone into it. This is a subject we've talked about for years, and I see progress. I see some resolution. So thank you so much, and continue where you're going.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Human Resources, please. Mr. Janin?
Good evening. Tonight's report is really a follow-up on a presentation that we had probably the same time last year when we initiated the pilot program. And what I'm here to report on is the outcome of that pilot program and some of the tweaks that we made in recommending a final evaluation product for the coming school year. The changes that we ended up making were relatively minor, and I will highlight them as we go through the process. But I guess I do want to remind ourselves of kind of where we came from and where we're going, and then do a little bit of just talking about the context of this in terms of what's going on with Act 10 and future changes within the state. You know, again, our current evaluation system is broken up and based on two statuses, whether you're a probationary or non-probationary teacher. That's something that's defined by the collective bargaining agreement. And the probationary teacher was a very traditional model. It wasn't directly linked to our state standards, but it was based on observation, and that was really the primary focus of the evaluation. There was some limited goal setting. It really wasn't the focus. The non-probationary evaluation cycle is probably what gave us more problems. It had alternate year evaluation choices. It was unclear at times what the different standards were, and while it, at the time of its development, it really did bring in some cutting-edge ideas in terms of evaluation. There were too many good ideas, and it gave it a lack of commonality in terms of comparing teachers and their own professional growth and development. It was a mutual decision for us, both the association and the district, to revise that. And there was a fairly large committee of both teachers and administrators and central office administrators who began the process of revising this during the 9-10 school year. And then it was piloted this year by an additional about 18 staff members involved at all the levels, high school, middle school, elementary, and 5 or 6 administrators who piloted this program over the past year. The objectives of the committee were to create something that was standard-based, that would promote professional growth, promote student learning. It was collaborative, promoted reflection, which again is one of the teacher standards, and also had multiple inputs, not purely just self-reflection or not purely just a principal evaluation, but allowed for some flexibility in terms of the data that we use to assess teachers. We wanted to retain the idea of performance improvement plans, be user-friendly, have that opportunity for rebuttal, create a reasonable timeline, and make sure that there's frequent, timely, periodic feedback, and was also cost-conscious. In that there are evaluation models that you can purchase, this is an extremely cost-conscious model in that we developed it ourselves, and we'll be implementing some of the technology needs to kind of make it as efficient as possible. A lot of those goals really started with surveying teaching staff and also holding focus groups with administrators. What's really added to this slide is the end. We conducted a year-long pilot, and we did some surveying and then discussion of those survey results with program participants. And that led us to make some changes. And I'm really going to focus on the changes, although for the benefit of the board, we will also run through the overall framework just because it's been a while since we've looked at it. The result, our goal was to have a program that was efficient, formative, interactive, constructive, growth-oriented, measurable, and collaborative. And I think what we need to keep in mind when we look at these lofty goals, for the majority of our teachers, an evaluation system is here to help them become better teachers. It is not the primary tool for performance managing teachers who are not meeting expectations. At any time during the system, we can jump tracks to what is commonly known as a critical review plan or developmental plan of assistance. So when you think about these goals, you're really talking about the majority of our teaching staff who are really on target in terms of professional growth, but that we want to make sure that we are aligning it with our district goals and continually getting improvement out of our teachers. What resulted is something that was from a collaborative process and encourages collaboration among teachers as colleagues, and also collaboration with their administrators. And when we walk through the process, I'll kind of point out some of those features. But it assumes a level of professional interaction that supports our professional learning communities. It's also aligned to the PI 34 process in terms of the manner in which we talk about and discuss goal setting. And that's really important because we have to realize that in addition to the expectations we put on staff, they're also going through a parallel process to maintain their licensure. And we really wanted this to become a useful tool to teachers to grow professionally. Not only that, in our discussions with DPI, as they look at possibly creating a statewide system, their goal is going to be to align evaluation to their own standards. So we are in front of the curve in that respect in terms of already having aligned our evaluation system. And it's an evaluation system that we've shared with the WASB and with other statewide stakeholders as they're looking at possibly a statewide system. So in some ways, by doing this work, we're helping to guide work at the state level as well. And it does require that teachers set data-driven goals. It's made that very clear about the fact that there's an expectation that teachers are working with student data and encouraging that growth. It kind of removes some ambiguity that there was in our prior goal-setting process. And that it explicitly evaluates teachers' contributions towards building team and district level goals. I don't think that we can get away from the fact that we have very clear district-wide goals. That drives what our buildings do in terms of setting building goals. When designing the evaluation process, that has to be incorporated in. And as I look at the evaluation document itself, it really serves two primary functions. One is that it sets expectations for our teachers, and two is it's really just a framework for our principals to have meaningful discussions about performance. And the reality is it will always be in how well our principals and human resources department implement the document more than the document itself. And that's going to be probably the most important piece to its success. After the pilot program, one of the first changes that we made and discussed as a committee was that we eliminated the reference to probationary teachers. That is a concept that is driven by the current contract. When we revise our board policies with respect to employment, we will have to determine, the board will have to determine whether or not that concept will remain. It was replaced with a system in which for the first 3 to 5 years when you're new to the district, you get evaluated on an annual basis, and after that you would graduate to a, basically it's an 18-month, but a 2-year evaluation cycle with a mid-year feedback. It really, the timeline for more veteran teachers is driven by our desire to make sure that we're focusing our resources on making good determinations in those first 3 years, and then a timeline that's reasonable in terms of evaluating our staff that's ongoing. Again, at any point in the process, though, we have the ability to jump tracks, so to speak, from a standard evaluation to one that's focused on performance improvement. We also made some revisions to the formal observation documents so that the both the observation and the pre-observation conference were a little bit more guided in terms of what we were asking principals to observe and what we're asking teachers to focus on. Those forms are kind of found at the end, and I'll reference them for you as we go through. And then finally, not finally, I skipped the second point. We wanted to provide some focus for the first 3 to 5 years in terms of what goals we're focused on. There are 10 state teacher standards, plus an 11th goal, which I guess you'd call basic employment citizenship skills. How well do you follow district policies, attendance at meetings, participation in your school-wide community. So basically 11 goals that teachers are evaluated on. We wanted to make sure that in the first 3 to 5 years of performance, there was a focus to each year. That's not to say that teachers at any level can't be evaluated on any goal, and they should be, but that administrators and teachers have a focus, and that we know someone didn't come into our district as a developing teacher and not have a close examination of all of their skills. And then finally, we are working towards an implementation of electronic workflow for the evaluation system, which should be trained on in September and implemented October 1st, which was actually part of the consent agenda this evening, which is going to help us focus our resources on what they should be, which is making sure that our evaluation system is being appropriately implemented versus shuffling paper. There are 2 cycles, and I'll briefly just go through them. One, again, is an annual teacher evaluation. In the past presentation, this was called probationary. The annual teacher evaluation is really just for people who in their first 3 to 5 years of employment here. The idea is that at the end of your 3rd year, you will probably, if you're performing successfully, be placed onto a biannual evaluation cycle. If not, you would either be non-renewed, or you may be exited from the system, or you may be given another year or two to get your performance to exactly where we want. But there's some flexibility in terms of remaining on that annual evaluation cycle for 3 to 5 years. After 5 years, if you have not met expectations, you'd be exited from the system. Again, with all of these cycles, this begins with self-reflection, where teachers reflect upon the 10 teacher standards, discuss them with their principal. There's a data collection process that goes on throughout the year. That data collection process is made up of multiple components. Teacher observation, and based and driven in part upon the goal that's set. So that can be collecting lesson plans. It could be creating evaluation documents, student data, whether that's map test data or individualized assessments. So there's data collection throughout the year. It requires teacher reflection as part of the evaluation. It requires feedback on each standard, although as we talked about, there'll be a focus of 3 standards in each year. And then there'll be a clear summative statement that directs future goal setting at the end of each evaluation. So this is what the cycle lays out like. Again, the October 1st is the goal in which in the first year teachers will have reflected and will then create their goal with their administrator. That's similar to our current timeline, although I would say we won't be training on the electronic document until October. So that due date will probably be set back to October 15th, which is something that we've done in past years because we've wanted the availability of map data before we've set goals. So we've traditionally had some flexibility with that. There's a mid-year review, and you'll notice that by February 1st, the summative evaluation is done. Again, this timeline presupposes the fact that we would want to have sufficient information prior to statutory non-renewal to make a determination on the annual evaluation cycle.
Ms. Jane?
Yes.
I'm having trouble reading that. Is that page the same as the page we have in our handout, annual teacher timeline?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And that would be on page
8.
8. As the same document is on page 8. So nothing's really changed in terms of the evaluation cycle. We were fairly pleased with it. It complies with the current board policy, which states that probationary teacher evaluations will be done in a time frame consistent to non-renew teachers who aren't performing satisfactorily. So it's a very short timeline. That timeline's driven by state statute. I would think in the first 3 to 5 years, we want to be very sure that we're keeping that timeline. It is not a timeline that makes sense for long-term employees because typically performance doesn't go down that quickly. It can, but there are also alternative ways to deal with that. The biannual teacher evaluation cycle, again, has a staggered timeline. The staggered timeline is really one so that we can stagger the work of our administrators. We create for ourselves false deadlines in which everything starts in September and ends in June. And the reality is our employment relationship with most of our staff is ongoing. And we wanted to be able to make sure that the work that our principals were doing was quality and not constrained by that timeline. So we created a staggered timeline where goal setting can be done later in the year and goals can go on for a longer period of time. And that is it's a 2 school year cycle, but it's basically 18 months. If you compare that with the professional development plan, those are 5-year goal setting timelines. So these are still fairly focused goals. and there's an ability to change goals mid-cycle, whether it's the 1 year or the 2 year process. Again, it begins with a process of self-reflection. Part of that self-reflection here is an option to discuss it with colleagues. It's important that we want to support that idea of professional collaboration among staff. Again, the data collection process throughout, which is driven by the goals that we set, the goals, of course, tied to student data. They must be data-driven goals. Requires teacher reflection as part of the evaluation. It allows feedback on all the standards, but again, when you're talking about goal setting with employees, you're going to focus your evaluation on those goals that either you as an administrator think need to be addressed, or that you as an administrator and a teacher have mutually agreed upon as the appropriate goal. But things change throughout an evaluation cycle, and if things arise, administrators obviously should be evaluating teachers on any standard that is appropriate. And then there's a clear summative statement that directs the future evaluation process, whether that's that the teacher has a required goal to work on, meaning there was some deficiency, or whether that is recommending more serious action, such as a developmental assistance plan, a critical review plan, or non-renewal. So that's clearly delineated on the evaluation form. This chart, which is the timeline, can be found on page 11 of the evaluation contract. Again, it's a 2-school year, works out to approximately 18 months, where goals are developed between October and December, and they are revisited mid-year. So we see teachers setting longer range goals and looking at longitudinal data a little bit more in terms of their goal setting. I won't walk through this necessarily in terms of the cycle in detail. It is the same really cycle that we've used before, but I can if you'd like. Again, we retain a performance improvement process. There are some minor revisions to that. There were elements of it that were required by contract. For example, the involvement of the executive director of the association was a requirement for a critical review plan. Since this evaluation cycle is now a prohibited subject of bargaining, it's probably not really a legally appropriate thing to include in our evaluation system. That's not to say that employees aren't free to have colleagues as a second set of ears at a meeting, simply that it's not required by contract, and so it wouldn't be a mandatory part of our process. But again, that's really driven more by state law than it is. I think all parties, both the association and the district, recognize the need for fair and meaningful tools to improve teacher performance. And that's the summation. Other questions? I guess before questions, I'd like to make one more comment. It was a very collaborative effort with the teachers involved and the administrators, and there's I think a lot of pride in terms of creating a system that's aligned with state standards, as we see that the state is casting around to create an evaluation system that does the same. I know that I regret that Paul Thusius isn't here tonight. He put a lot of work into this, and I know that he's moved on to other things, but I think he deserves some special recognition for this product. And then also Debbie Brent, the association president, who would be here tonight, but she had a commitment out of town, and she wants to send her regrets and know that she wishes she could be here. So.
Board members, questions or comments? Please, Mr.
I had one question. Thank you. I know having a good evaluation system, the teachers will enjoy being fairly evaluated and helping to improve, and it will help student learning as well. I just had one question. The second oval where after complete self-reflection, it says write one goal based on an area of interest. It wasn't clear to me how that relates to a teacher that might have multiple deficiencies, and if that's addressed elsewhere, like say an elementary teacher that might need help with classroom management and say has not as strong, say, in reading or math instruction as you would like. Are both of those things addressed elsewhere, and is the one goal different from those?
If you were a teacher with deficiencies, you wouldn't be on this plan. We would create a developmental assistance plan, and we would list as many goals as were necessary. If there were areas where someone is not as strong as others, there might be a required goal setting where the administrator says, this should be your goal. But if we're talking about someone with multiple deficiencies in multiple areas, they would probably be not on this evaluation cycle. They would be on a developmental assistance plan, and it would look a lot differently. Those are crafted to the individual deficiencies.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Further questions or comments? Yes, Mary Jo.
Do you anticipate that we're not going to be able to use this because we're going to be given something from the state? Or do you know anything about,
I feel pretty confident that the state is going to put forward a system for administrators and teachers that will be required. I think there'll be some components that may be flexible, but I guess I'll say I'm hopeful that it's going to look somewhat like this based on the standards, and so the training that we're going to do for this year isn't for naught, that it will play into whatever system the state puts forward, but there's a very clear direction from the state in their collaborative efforts with the DPI to develop the evaluation system and for the following school year.
is there any way we can be proactive in that?
Well, I think we are. We sent actually this model to one of the members of that group that's working on it. He'd actually asked for it after he was here at their last board meeting, and we were discussing it a little bit. So I think it's important that we stay engaged in the process so we can have some input in it.
Yeah. And that said, because it focuses on the 10 Wisconsin teacher standards, we're fairly certain that what comes out of the state is going to align with their own standards. So the training that we're doing here will be useful to our principals and to our teachers and move us away from a system right now where people are on various evaluation schemes. So it may be a two-step process that will be here for a year and then on to a state scheme. But the standards are important, and even for the administrators in terms of evaluating administrators, one of the first standards is and understand all 10 teacher standards. And so even just to be developing that common language between our administrators and our teaching staff and central office to say this is what's going to drive the discussion around teacher competency, I think is going to go a long way to helping us implement what comes down the road from the state.
One other question.
Yes.
The other thing I'm just wondering about is going to the biannual assessment or evaluation. If the assumption is, that a teacher after 3 to 5 years doesn't need to be evaluated for the purpose of improving their performance or whatever. I'm thinking about, Dr. Ertl is evaluated every year. I'm not sure what it's like in other areas, but why not every year?
We really has to do mostly with a timeline and a desire to spread out the work of our principals so that they can devote more time to evaluating teachers. Really the only way to skew that is to move where the time is being used at different times of the year. So by moving to a biannual system, which is really every 18 months instead of every 9, because remember the school year is not quite 12. We're able to spread out that work so that administrators can have meaningful conversations and have the time to sit and do what they should be doing. I think one of the comments that we got from administrators is that realistically, when they're talking in June of filling out evaluations for every person in their building, and they've evaluated someone over a number of years, that it is difficult to devote the right amount of time to those evaluations when they all come due at the same time. So this system is one that kind of has a compromise in that there is frequent feedback. There's mid-year, mid-cycle, I should say, not mid-year, but mid-cycle meetings between staff and principal, but that summative document is only due once a year. We looked at the state statute when we thought about doing that. State statute only requires that teachers be evaluated every 3 years. We thought that was really just not a positive way to go. And the reality is that mid-year, mid-cycle feedback session really does have most of the hallmarks of a evaluation. They review the goal, they review the status of the goal, they provide feedback, they look at the data to date, and they say, here's where I think you're at. It's just a shorter evaluation. So I think one way to look at it is there's a mid-year, mid-cycle mini evaluation followed by a summative at the end of 2 years.
Okay, thank you.
Further comment or question? Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak on this? Thank you, Mr. Janan.
Thank you.
Very, very exciting.
It is.
And it sounds positive coming from the staff as well as administration. So, again, thank you for the work that's gone into this.
Thank you.
Dr. Ertl, please.
Yes, just an announcement that the board meeting schedule for 11/12 is out, and they will be held normally on the second and fourth Mondays of each month and begin at 7 p.m. here at the Fisher Building. There are 2 months that only have one meeting, and that's December and April, and that's because of 2 different breaks of the school year.
Board members, any questions? Seeing none, is there any community comment? Seeing none, at this point, is there any public comment on any non-agenda item at this time? Okay. Seeing none, may I have a motion to adjourn the regular meeting and reconvene into executive session pursuant to the Wisconsin statutes 19.85 subsection LF to consider the educational request on behalf of an expelled student, which will involve discussion of personal history or disciplinary data of a specific person. And pursuant to Wisconsin statutes 19.85 subsection 1 and G to confer with legal counsel regarding advice with respect to litigation in which it is likely to become involved. A motion is in order.
So moved.
Mrs. Fee, thank you. Is there a second?
Second,
That was Michael?
yes.
Thank you. Roll call vote, please.
Mrs. Fee?
Yes.
Mr. Giroux?
Yes.
Mr. Croner?
Yes.
Mr. Meyer?
Yes.
Mrs. Muehlfeld?
Yes.
Mrs. Randall?
Yes.
Mrs. Weber?
Yes. Let's take 5 minutes and reconvene at 8:55. Thank you.